Thanks to Jackie and Mona and the entire team at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network for being such a leader in this field of providing information and opportunities and forums for the cancer survivor community and the broader healthcare sector to learn more about opportunities like this to get involved so much in the care continuum and the treatments that are available. Today's webinar is going to be about the importance of clinician engagement in the health technology assessment process. Many of you know, and some of you might have seen previous webinars that we've done on the opportunities for patient advocacy groups to provide input to HTA or health technology assessment. In fact, I've led a couple of those in the past. And the oncology world and the oncology HTA world in particular has really been a pioneer in encouraging external stakeholder input to the process right from the beginning. I believe it goes back to 2010 for pCODR, and it's been adopted by all of CADTH programs, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, for the Common Drug Review program as well. So once again, the oncology HTA world has taken the lead in encouraging that kind of input and expanded that opportunity to clinicians and groups of clinicians. Today we're going to learn about how that can actually happen. As Allison said, we're going to be doing some interactive polling. So get ready on the webinar, GoToWebinar dashboard that you see there. You're going to be asked to respond to some specific questions, and we're going to see some results and react to those in real time. There's also a box in your dashboard for questions, and I really encourage everyone on the line to think of some questions as you go. Don't wait until the end to actually write them in. Get them going as you hear the webinar, because that way we're going to be able to be ready to respond to them, and that will give us some important themes to talk through towards the end of the webinar. Unlike other webinars, this may not take a full hour, so we might be done a little bit earlier than that, but that will depend on the level of engagement and interest in questions we have, which I expect to be excellent, because we've got two extremely experienced and thoughtful leaders from within the health technology assessment system. Our first panelist is Alexandra Chambers. Alex Chambers is the director of the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review at Caddis, and she's been working at Caddis since 2014. She's got experience as a clinical epidemiologist and a research coordinator at McMaster, and a longtime friend of and contributor to webinars like this. So honestly, I know Jackie and Mona are very appreciative of what you've been able to do as a leader within pCODR, Alex. Our second panelist and our final panelist is Dr. Craig Earl, a medical oncologist at Sunnybrook in Toronto. He's also Vice President of Cancer Control at CPAC, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, Senior Scientist at ICES, the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences. We've got so many acronyms, we could keep on going. And Dr. Earle has been a central person within the pCODR process from a scientific evaluation perspective. I understand that he's stepped away a little bit from that role, so we're hoping to hear from you, Craig, in terms of how you might participate in some or contribute to some of these submissions on your own as a practicing medical oncologist, now that you're not a reviewer on the inside. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Alex for you to walk us through the process and lead us in some interactive polling, and then I'll be back on for some of the Q's and A's towards the end of the webinar. Thanks very much. Alex.
Great. Thanks, Bill, and thanks to CCSN for hosting this webinar today. I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you about the clinician engagement process through pCODR. So we have a few agenda items today that we'd like to work through. So I'm going to speak to the first three, just looking at what the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review Program is, talking a little bit about the process and how we engage clinicians through the pCODR program, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Earle to talk a little bit about the value of engagement and really from the clinician's perspective. So as Bill had mentioned, we do have some polling questions that we are going to ask throughout the course of the webinar today. So here is the first polling question. So just trying to get a sense of who we have dialing in today and trying to understand where everyone is coming from. So just leave that open for a moment as people respond. Great to see. So I can see based on the responses that we do have a variety of folks from all areas. We've got some patient representatives, some clinicians, industry members and consultants, and then just a few government and HTAs as well. So that's terrific. Just keep moving on there. So just an overview of Caddis pCODR program. So pCODR has been a part of Caddis since 2014. It's been almost 4 years now. And the role of the pCODR program really is to look at cancer drugs and make recommendations to the ministries of health and provincial cancer agencies to guide their funding decisions. The reason why pCODR came about was because there was inconsistency across the provinces and the jurisdictions in terms of the drug funding decisions that were being made. And so the intent of the program is to bring consistency and clarity to the assessment of cancer drugs when considering important factors, the clinical evidence, cost effectiveness, and the patient perspectives. As part of the program, we are committed to having a core value of transparency, and we try to be as accountable as we can to the patients and the public and responsive to industry. So here's the next polling question. So I was going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about the public drug funding and approval process in Canada, but I thought before we got into it, see how much information people know about the process. And I just looking at the polling results here, it's actually a pretty even split between good knowledge and fair knowledge. So maybe I will just go to the next slide and just talk briefly about drug access and who does what. So Health Canada, of course, is the regulator, and they are the ones who determine the effect and safety of drugs and authorize the market approval within Canada. Next, once a drug is authorized to be marketed in Canada, it comes through the HTA, or the Health Technology Assessment process. And so the role of the HTA groups is to assess the value of the drug if it were to be introduced into the system. In Canada, there are 3 primary bodies that look at drugs. So within CADTH, there are 2 programs. So there's pCODR, which looks specifically at oncology drugs. Then there's the Common Drug Review that looks at the non-oncology drugs. Quebec has their own process through ANES, and that's how they review drugs through Quebec. Next, once there is a recommendation made, then it goes to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance for price negotiation on the price, and then finally it will go to the Ministries of Health and the cancer agencies, who will make the ultimate decision as to whether or not the drug will be funded in a particular jurisdiction. So when looking at clinician engagement and within pCODR, just taking one step back there, and when looking at health technology assessment, the intent is to have a multidisciplinary approach to looking at these drugs. So the intent is to include many stakeholders, patients, clinicians, the payers, the methodologists, the health economists, really looking at it from all angles. And so today we're really focused on how clinicians are engaged through that HTA process. So when the program was initially designed, there were two primary ways where clinicians were engaged. First was through the clinical guidance panels. So for each review that we do, we engage 3 to 5 clinical experts who are experts in the current field and have familiarity with the disease and the indication and the drug under review, and they provide context for the review. The other way that we engage clinicians is through the Expert Review Committee, so Perk. And so the Perk Committee consists of 16 members, many of whom are clinicians, but there are also patient members, health economists, and pharmacists on that committee. So those were the two main ways that clinicians were engaged through the pCODR program. And then just about 2 years ago, we introduced another way for clinicians to be engaged, and this was through the Registered Clinician Input process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that process fits in to the entirety of the review process. So this is just a quick overview of how the pCODR review process works. The Registered Clinician Input and Feedback process was modeled right after the patient input process, whereby clinicians are invited to provide input up front, just like the patient groups, following a template. And that input is used to feed in through the review. That information is given to the review team. It informs the expert review committee's recommendation. And then once that initial recommendation is issued, the clinicians, just like the patients, have an opportunity to provide feedback before the final recommendation is issued. So then the question comes up, why would we include registered clinician input? And there's a couple of key reasons. The first being for collaboration and representation. We're trying to broaden the reach of what we are doing here. As I had mentioned, with clinician engagement, originally with pCODR, we were engaging 3 to 5 clinicians per review, plus the members on Perk. However, we recognize there's so many clinicians and so many different perspectives across the country. We really wanted to find a way to really hear from more people and more clinicians from across the country, and this really does enable having that voice heard on a wider or broader scale. And the second reason why we decided to go ahead with the registered clinician input was to hear more from the clinicians about the regional and local issues from a practice setting. So we can learn a lot about the trials and read from the trials that we're reviewing, but we're really looking for that actual lived experience and personal experience with the drugs under review. The next question is, how can clinicians participate? So in order to participate, just like with the patient input, clinicians must register. They register one time through our website. In order to be eligible, you must be an actively practicing oncologist and a member of a provincial cancer agency or similar body. I think it's of important note that if you are a Perk member or if you are part of the clinical guidance panel for a drug under review, then in that case you cannot provide clinician input. It's just you just have the one opportunity per review to provide input. And so we have another polling question for you. So the next question is, have you registered to provide input on a pCODR drug review? And we're just having the poll open here. Looks like the bulk have not registered as of yet, but that's why we are doing these webinars, to try to get more clinicians to engage and to work with us through pCODR and to really engage on the reviews. So how is clinician input submitted? Again, very much like the patient input, an email notification is sent about 1 month in advance of when we expect to receive the drug, and then the deadline for input is 10 business days after the submission is received. So it ends up being about 6 weeks where we give you advance notice to prepare the input. There is a template to complete for each submission, asking similar questions, but again, really trying to get at experience with the drug under review rather than speaking to the trials. We have a process to look at the clinical trial. The point of the clinician input is really to understand the personal practice experience with the drug under review. And just a little bit more detail here on providing clinician input. Input can be provided either by an individual oncologist or in a joint submission. I think when we had first initiated the clinician input process, we didn't appreciate that the clinicians would want to work together and put together a joint submission, but we've found the joint submissions to be particularly helpful because there's already been a certain level of consensus generating by the time we receive the submission. So it actually is really helpful for us to hear from a group of clinicians as we're trying to put the submission together. All of the clinicians who participate must declare their conflict of interest, and this is consistent with everyone who participates throughout the pCODR process, whether you're a Perk member or a patient group or staff or anybody that we work with. Everyone provides their conflict of interest, and then the conflict of interest will be publicly posted on the Caddis website as it applies to all other participants as well. Okay, and so although I know there's very few of you who have registered to provide input, maybe those of you who have you provided input on a drug? And it looks like a few have. It looks like more have not than have, but it looks like we have had some people actually with experience of submitting. So that's great to see, and hopefully we can get more of that. And then the next question is, if you have registered, please indicate why you haven't provided your input yet. And you can see the series of options down below. I'll just give it a minute there to see if there's any others. And it looks like the reasons for not providing input is familiarity with the registered clinician process. So again, hopefully this webinar will be helpful in that space. Okay, and now how can clinicians respond to a Perk recommendation? So I've spent a lot of time talking about providing input, but clinicians, if they've provided input on a drug under review, they also have an opportunity to provide feedback on a recommendation. There is a template to provide feedback, and it really is Perk seeking information on the recommendation that they've made, looking to see if they've missed any important factor, if there's any difference in interpretation, if there's any clarification that's required, really looking to see if there is agreement on the recommendation that has been issued and any comments that stakeholders may have. So the feedback does open up to not only clinicians, but to patient groups as well. The submitter and our provincial advisory group also provides feedback on the recommendation. So what I'm going to do is I think I'll pause now, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Earle, and he can actually speak to how he has used the clinician input in his experience as both a clinical guidance panel member and a Perk member.
Thanks so much, Alex. I think the main point that I want to make about this is, as you've said, that what this is really the opportunity to get the input of practicing expert clinicians, that viewpoint. Of course, the clinical guidance panel, the CGP, all consists of specialist expert clinicians, but they're really looking, their main purpose is to review the evidence very, very strictly. Similarly, on Perk, we may or may not have a particular specialist relevant to the specialty of a particular drug, but both of these bodies are really looking at the health technology assessment parts primarily, and the input that we get from expert clinicians from the outside is really with a different hat. How does this impact our reviews? I think it actually can be very impactful. Of course, we expect most of the submissions to be positive and in support of the drug under review, because I think most of us are looking for as many tools as possible to treat our patients. But what we use these for is you can really get a sense from the submissions of what the level of enthusiasm really is out there. You can read between the lines if people are fairly lukewarm and, this is a nice to have but not need to have type drug, or, this is something that should be available to patients, but maybe I wouldn't give up any other drugs for it. That could be positive. We've even had some where clinicians have submitted negative reviews saying, this drug is toxic and really doesn't add very much. And of course, that's pretty compelling when you're looking at some of these. So, as I say, the general sense of enthusiasm and how the community views this drug in the broader context of treating a particular patient population. I would say some of the other things that come up are related to the quality of life effects and convenience or feasibility things. So often when we're reviewing evidence for Perk or in the clinical guidance panels, we're looking at quality of life instruments that may or may not have been used in a trial, and certainly not all trials actually measure quality of life during treatment, but even those who do, the instruments are fairly blunt, and it's not uncommon to have two treatments that have, no real statistically significant difference between the EORTC QOQ-C30 scores, for example. But if you're a clinician who's actually treated patients with both of these drugs or regimens, you may actually know that there are differences in terms of tolerability or some other effects. Maybe it's more related to the logistics or feasibility things that may not, really bubble to the surface when being reviewed by clinicians who maybe have not had the chance to give the drugs and see what they're like in real life. So it's giving that extra nuanced and, where possible, experience with the treatments that can be very important in our deliberations. And so, it's largely about how the drug is viewed in the broader community, and things that may not always come through when we're strictly looking at the evidence. I guess another example I could mention is that, sometimes we're looking at evidence that may not be at the top of the evidence hierarchy. And if we're not, if we're looking at it as clinicians who maybe aren't in the particular area, and we may be questioning, well, shouldn't a randomized trial be done to really give us a better view of this? If clinician input were to tell us, this is the best evidence we're ever going to get because either, the whole community has accepted this and there's no way anyone would enroll patients to a randomized trial, or, sometimes we don't realize that a particular subset of patients that a drug is targeted to, there aren't enough patients in the country or in North America to do a randomized trial. And those sorts of things, to have that spelled out, can be very important. So for those of you on the webinar who are clinicians who might consider giving this sort of feedback, my main advice would be, if you care about a drug, don't assume that you know what the Perk recommendation is going to be, because I certainly hear about it. I think we all do who are involved in this process. It's people who, just assume, oh yeah, we've got this great new drug, it's going to go through Perk and then it'll be funded, and then are shocked when a negative recommendation comes, and then they want to have input. For better or for worse, the way the process is set up is that you don't get to have input at that point. So input can be brief, but register and say something about the drug, because then you have the opportunity to affect a reconsideration of the decision or the recommendation. I think at this point I'll stop and pass it back to Alex.
Thanks, Craig. So we have one more polling question for you, and let me just pull it up here. So did you find the session helpful in understanding the clinician engagement process through pCODR? And then once I think we've got that, I'll hand it back to you, Bill, and because I think that is the end of our presentation, and we can open it up for questions.
Thanks very much, both of you, for doing such an excellent job walking through the process itself. We've got already some great questions started from people who are participating. I wanted to kick it off because we have some clinicians on the line. Dr. Earle, now that you're off the scientific review panel or direct involvement.
Actually, I'm not, as far as I knew. But
I was going to ask you, and maybe this is still relevant. Pretend you are.
Okay.
How would you work in this opportunity into a busy clinical practice? Like, what are some really practical tips for either how easy it is to do? Alex mentioned collaborating with some of your colleagues, but in terms of bringing that clinical experience and having it resonate, what would you do to make that happen?
So I can speak from my own experience in Ontario. Most provinces, when Alex talked about having sort of group submissions, it usually comes through, most provinces have some sort of a disease site group that either within the province makes recommendations about treatment pathways or guidelines, et cetera. And that's where, at least in Ontario, the main group submissions come from. So if you are involved already with one of those disease site groups, there's a bit of a mechanism within your province where the emails get sent out and this drug is being reviewed. Do you have anything that you want to say about it? And over the course of a day or two, people who feel strongly about it respond, a submission goes in, and then afterwards, when we see the recommendation, people are able to then comment, and a group submission goes back in. So that's, in many ways, I think the easiest way, because if you can be connected in there, you can tap into another infrastructure. Aside from that, I would say if you don't have access to that sort of thing, making sure that you're on a list to hear about the things that are coming up. And then, as I say, it does not have to be a detailed or extended input. It can really just be a couple of lines that tells about your level of enthusiasm, or if you have any anecdotal types of information to pass on. It shouldn't be a barrier, the amount of work involved. I'm done, Bill.
Oh, it's possible we lost Bill.
Oh, sorry. I had you on mute for a second. Alex, on a related question from one of our listeners, can you comment on the fact that pCODR does not want the clinician input to look like or be completed by the patient organization? And then, in preparing for this webinar, we talked about the role of patient advocacy groups potentially in doing webinars like this, or even drawing on some of the clinical experts in their own networks, for instance, medical advisory boards. Maybe that's another potential opportunity for knowledge translation of this opportunity. But the specific question in terms of complementing what the patient advocacy group will get in separately. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for that that bill. I do think there's a role that the patient groups can play in trying to get more clinicians engaged through the process, because the patient groups, as you know, are very engaged with the process, and they've been very helpful, and they've been very willing to work with us, which has been terrific. So as you mentioned, you know, through their patient or their medical advisory boards, that would be a great way to engage more clinicians. However, I think, and again, to your point about the question regarding whether the clinician input should be different than the patient input, it is very important for Perk, and maybe I'll let Craig speak to this as well, but they want to hear both perspectives. So they're really interested in the patient input. They're really trying to understand what is the experience from a patient's perspective, and what are they hoping to get out of treatment? What is the experience of them and their caregivers and their families? While on the other hand, you know, the clinician input, although there could be some similarities in terms of what they're looking for, the clinician input is really to speak from the clinician's experience with the drug, knowing, you know, what other treatment options are available, understanding the potential side effects and the barriers. So it's, although there are likely parallels in what would be provided through the patient input and the clinician input, it really is important that we're really trying to get at the clinician voice versus the patient voice with the clinician input.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. We do see ones where we know that the clinician hasn't written it. It just is not, for a variety of reasons. You can just tell that it wasn't their own input, and so of course that you know, gets subconsciously discounted when we see that sort of thing. And we also know, you know, we've just reviewed the evidence very rigorously. So if people are coming on and saying things that just aren't true in the submissions, that's not going to sway us in any way. So it is more to, as I say, to get the views of the clinicians based on clinical experience.
Craig, a follow-on question from one of our listeners is around the weight of clinician input versus potentially the other things that Perk is considering, and maybe that's an opportunity to explain the deliberative process that Perk uses to come up with its recommendation.
Right. So it's a good point. The clinician input is one that isn't explicitly separate in the deliberative process. And Alex, if I say something wrong, you can correct me. So it's part of the clinical considerations of the effectiveness and overall benefits of the drug, which is one of the four things that we consider. The second is the economic implications of the drug. The third is the patient input, and then the fourth is the feasibility logistical types of considerations within the Canadian healthcare context. So the clinician input isn't a separate one of those boxes, but yet it feeds in, and I would say it colors and nuances the considerations of clinical benefit primarily, although it can also, as I was talking about, have give context or support around issues that may be primarily in the patient submission around feasibility, convenience, quality of life effects, or logistics as well.
Excellent. We've got a question around, I think, drawing on one of your issues that you brought forward, Dr. Earle, around the hierarchy of evidence. If either a lower level of evidence has come forward, let's say phase 2 clinical trial evidence, as opposed to phase 3. One of our participants is asking around, where phase 3 trials, or at least RCT trials, are not feasible or ethical. Why have approvals of drugs with phase 2 evidence declined in the last few years? Are there examples of clinician input that have sort of turned the tide and actually ended up with a supportive, positive clinical recommendation that you can think of?
So we do have examples where positive recommendations have come through based on phase 2 trials. I'm not aware, I think the way you phrased it was that that has declined over time. I'm actually not sure what the trends are in that, but it very much is a case-by-case type of situation. And in those situations, we look at things like, as you said, the feasibility of will a phase 3 trial ever be done, but then also it's the magnitude of the benefit. You know, is this a parachute, no parachute type of thing where it's obvious that a parachute is good, you don't have to do a randomized trial, versus something where, you know, there's some hint of benefit, but this is not something that is about to change the world. And that is the type of thing where clinician input can certainly nuance and color and inform the discussions. So I'm not sure I can name an example. I'm thinking, you know, I'm thinking back and remembering more conversations about particular drugs where that has been important. And, you know, in many of those, it may also come from the clinical guidance panel who says, you know, it's not phase 3 data, but, you know, for these reasons, we don't think we'll end up with better data, et cetera. So the clinician input still can come from these other quarters, but certainly is important in those situations.
We've got two sets of questions, and I'm going to do my best to consolidate them to some extent. One is around how pCODR will continue to engage clinicians in the process. How will clinicians know if their feedback has made a difference to the initial and to the final recommendation? And in the same vein, because this is still in the pilot phase, how can feedback be gained as to what's working and what isn't in the process? And how will this be a learning system, so that, you know, what is the next phase of pCODR's physician engagement process? Maybe that's to you, Alex.
Yeah, that's great, Bill. So like I said, we've been working with this pilot now since February of 2016. In that time, we have 170 clinicians registered. We've had, out of a possible 34 drugs under review, we've had clinician input on 29 of them. So there has been fairly good uptake to date with the clinician input. But I think, to your point, I think, you know, we really are looking now, how can we take this to the next step? And we have, you know, spoken with several clinicians. We've heard from Perk and from the other clinicians that we've been working with that there are some changes that we could make to make the input a little bit more meaningful. One of the ways that we are going to change the clinician input sooner than later, we have looked at the template that we've been using, and we are going to make some revisions to the template to try to solicit a little bit more information, again, about the experience with the drug or the indication that the drug is meant to treat. Again, trying to make it a little bit more focused. And so that's one area. Another area, and this is a bigger initiative throughout CADTH, is to try to find a way to make the emails a little bit more targeted to one's specialty. So, and this is a longer term goal, but hopefully we can accomplish this within the year. So, for instance, if you're an expert in lung cancer, you would only receive the lung cancer drugs under review as opposed to receiving all of the drugs. And that's just something else that we've heard from clinicians that, you know, and I think we all experience having, you know, our inboxes overloaded with information. So anything that we can do to, again, streamline the process a bit. And we are always looking to streamline the registration process a little bit more, and we've heard from clinicians, you know, how we can work on that as well. Ontario has done very well in terms of getting their tumor groups engaged and throughout the clinician engagement process. And so over the course of the next year, we are going to try and work with the other provinces as well to see if we can get as much uptake as we've had in Ontario throughout the country. We do the 170 registered clinicians. They are representative of across the country, but there's definitely work we can do in other provinces to try to get the numbers up there as well. That answer your question, Bill?
It wasn't mine. It was actually from one of our listeners, and I think it does. I'm sure we'll get a great comment, a thumbs up if it does. Yeah, I thought it was very comprehensive. Thanks. Another set of questions are around if Canada does not have much experience with the drug under review, if there are no clinicians in Canada that have used it in clinical trials or through the special access program or otherwise, what can clinicians provide in terms of input? Can they look to real-world evidence from other jurisdictions, from their colleagues that they've met at ESMO or ASCO, et cetera? What are some other ways to get that clinician input if we don't have Canadian experience?
Maybe I'll jump in and say people can still give input, and it's probably more than in the realm of this is something that is becoming the new standard worldwide. It may just have been a subgroup of a phase 2 study, but for these various reasons, this is really taken over, and at least gives us that context of what the global view is. And even if you haven't used a drug, maybe you have a good sense of the current treatment. You have to come in every day for 14 days in a row or something, just something that can really talk about some of the benefits that aren't front and center if you're just reading the publication of a phase 3 study.
Alex, anything to add on that point, international evidence?
Yeah, no, I think Craig has covered it. I do think, again, even if you haven't had experience with the drug under review, your current experience with current therapies, and again, highlighting the challenges and how the drug under review may be able to address some of those challenges, I think is always helpful.
Great. We've got a question that might actually maybe go to you, Alex, from our last question, or actually we have another one that just came up. Is there an opportunity to gather real-world evidence feedback as a follow-up to the initial clinician input? And the way I read that, we're seeing Caddis move from point-in-time assessments of individual products to a more life cycle approach and looking at an entire disease state and trying to actually assess everything around that disease state to optimize the health system's intervention. Do you see pCODR moving in that direction so that you could gather real-world evidence to follow up, support, complement, validate, or critique some of the initial clinician input? That might be a very complex and loaded question, but how about it?
It's a good question. So I definitely think real-world evidence seems to the topic that we're all talking about right now, and trying to figure out how do we incorporate real-world evidence into our reviews. I would say it would be challenging to get it in through the feedback for a couple of reasons. One, because there's such a short time frame for it, and also because through the feedback process, and it quite deliberately is the case, is that we don't want to be looking at new information. So you can't be introducing new data that Perk hasn't had a chance to look at through the feedback process. It really is to look at the information that they had a chance to look at for the initial recommendation. But as I said, I do think there are opportunities to incorporate real-world evidence into our reviews. Just trying to figure out where it fits best is, I think, the question that we're all asking.
Thanks, Alex. We have several questions around statistics and some of the timelines and reviews of how pCODR recommendations are coming through. And one is, do you track how often a drug is not recommended, even though there is a supportive clinical guidance panel report, and a few specific issues like that? I mean, you've got access to some of these questions as well. do you want to give us a bit of a snapshot of some of the things that listeners can expect in terms of the analysis that the pCODR engages in? And I know in the past you've done some excellent reports on, for instance, uptake of your recommendations. Is there anything you can give a snapshot to on that front for the listeners?
Sure. So with the clinical guidance panel, so as I had mentioned, that's 3 to 5 clinical experts in a specific area, which have been, specifically recruited to look at the drug under review. And their role is to look at the clinical trial data and then provide some context and interpretation around that. So they are specifically tasked with looking at the clinical information. When Perk makes their recommendations, and as Craig had alluded to, Perk applies their deliberative framework. So they're looking at the clinical benefit, they're looking at the patient values, they're looking at the economics, and then they're looking at the adoption feasibility. So Perk is looking at the totality of those 4 quadrants. So there are some instances where a clinical guidance panel conclusion won't match up with Perk's recommendation, but it is because they're looking at it from a different lens, and Perk is looking at it from that totality of evidence, while the clinical guidance panel really is looking at it from that clinical perspective. So it does happen. I don't actually have statistics on how frequently it might happen. I don't know, Craig, do you want to comment? I know you've sat on both sides of those.
Yeah, my impression would be that they're mostly concordant, meaning that if the clinical guidance panel is a clear that there is clear, definite clinical benefit from this treatment, that you may end up then with a conditional recommendation, meaning that we're saying that we recommend it, but cost effectiveness may need to be improved, or the feasibility and logistics of how this very intensive treatment is going to be applied are worked out, or a positive recommendation. But there are some where the clinical guidance panel recommendation, while it may on balance be positive, it may also be acknowledging that there's a lot of uncertainty, either because of level of evidence or small magnitude. There is benefit, but it's a 2-week median survival or something like that. And on balance, there's a lot of toxicity and other considerations. So my impression is that they're mostly concordant, if you consider those sort of gray zones about what's a positive recommendation on either side or not, but that there are some that are discordant.
Excellent. Let's go back to a couple of the more basic questions about how the system works, Alex. And while people are coming up with any additional questions, I think that we might be rounding the webinar out this afternoon. One is on just general timelines for how long the whole pCODR review process takes. So we talked about 10 business days for this feedback, et cetera. But if you give us a quick snapshot of where the pCODR review process fits and how long it actually takes to happen, mainly on that. And then secondly, one of our listeners is asking, what is an example of feasibility issues in that 4th quadrant that you referenced earlier, Craig? What is a feasibility issue that we can look to? And then we'll probably ask you for final thoughts, and we'll close it out. Alex?
Great. Yeah. So, so your first question was regarding timelines. So most of our reviews take between 4 and 5 months to complete from the point of when we receive the review or the submission to review to the point where it gets a initial recommendation from the committee. However, in addition to that time, we do ask our submitters to give us 4 months of notice before a drug comes in for review to pCODR, and there's a number of reasons for that. It helps us to prepare for the review, but I think even greater than that, it actually helps us to notify the provinces that this drug is coming in, and it helps them prepare their input for the drug that's going under review. It helps us give us time to identify the clinicians that we will want to work with through the course of the review. Gives time for us to notify clinicians and patients that the submission is coming in so that they can start preparing their input. So there's a lot of pre-work that goes into the submissions before they come in to us at pCODR, and the intent of that is so that when we receive that review that we can hit the ground running and have all the information that we need in order to do the work that we need to do. Because the information that we get from the patients, from the clinicians, from the provincial advisory group, that all goes in to feed how we define the systematic review protocol. It goes into the economic reanalysis that is done. So all of that pre-work really is important to have up front so that it can inform the review so that we can have it completed within that 4 to 5 month timeline, so that Perk can have all the information they need to make the most informed decision that they can. In terms of feasibility issues, oftentimes the feasibility issues will be the ones that have been raised by the provincial advisory group. The provincial advisory group is made up of drug plan managers from the ministries of health and the cancer agencies across the country. So it can be a variety of different issues. It can speak to issues of oral versus IV drugs, because there's different policies and funding for those across the country. It can have to do with chair time and how long it takes for a drug to infuse. It can have to do with pumps that are required, any additional infrastructure that's required, any additional monitoring that might be required to manage adverse events. So it's sort of the additional resources required if that drug were to become available. And it also speaks, so in addition to all that infrastructure and resource requirement, it also speaks to the budget impact of the drug, and that's where the affordability comes in as well to the discussion. I don't know if did you want to add something to that, Craig?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered that well. Budget impact is probably one that we see a lot because, at least at the listed price, it would consume the entire drug budget or something. But of course then it becomes an issue of price negotiation and things. But as you say, there are some that are very, very concrete. We've seen drugs come in that would require every patient to be hospitalized for a month, for example, or something where you would, a large volume of patients would need daily intravenous chair time, and you would literally have to build new infusion suites to be able to accommodate this, and so that becomes a big feasibility concern.
So some of these nuts and bolts questions around the whole pCODR process probably would lend themselves to a future webinar to either drill down into other specific aspects of the pCODR review or some of the trends and timelines. So what I think we should do is close this out with any final thoughts on clinician input, and maybe Alex, if you wouldn't mind putting up your contact information on the next slide. That would ensure that listeners and participants can know where to get in touch with you. And I would just say, drilling down into the clinician input opportunity, this is a fantastic opportunity for people to get involved, more involved, and not wait until after decisions have been made on funding to have an opportunity to get involved. So, any final thoughts from the two of you, and then Alex, what do you think about the raft of questions we have coming forward as a potential topic for either future or other webinars and engaging the cancer survivor community?
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer that question first. I do think I can see the list of questions there, and absolutely, I think there it looks like there's another opportunity here for further discussion. So more than happy to participate in a further discussion. But I would like to thank everyone for taking the time and dialing in and listening today. Like I said, this clinician input pilot has been going on for just about 2 years now, and we really are looking to sort of take it to that next step. So look to hear more from us in the next few months, and as we look to make these revisions, really looking to hear from you to understand how we can be engaging clinicians more. And if you have any comments, then we're more than interested in hearing them, and really looking to make the clinician engagement process as meaningful as we can for everyone who participates in the pCODR process.
So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to hearing all of your input.
And Craig, thanks especially to you. I mean, I understand you were in clinic today and taking your time out of a very busy schedule, not only to participate in this webinar, but also to give a lot of your time to the whole process and the policy as they roll out. So this is really very appreciated, and we're getting lots of kudos and similar thanks from those on the line. So I'll turn it back to Allison to close out the webinar, and I hope to see everyone soon.